So how do we cope with that? Yet at the same time, tourism is a major industry within this landscape of ours as well. So it's highly appropriate that we have a talk today on, is there a future for tourism? And it's my pleasure to actually introduce Sandro Carnicelli, who's a senior lecturer in events and tourism at the University of the West of Scotland. And he's been talking and looking and working about tourism in general all over the world. In Brazil and in various parts, in New Zealand and various other parts of the world as well. So it's good to have him in Scotland. I hope he's going to tell us how to manage this wonderful landscape that we've got here and just give us an impression of just what it is for the future of tourism here in Scotland. So please welcome Sandro.
Thank you, Stuart. Hello everyone. So I apologize for my accent. So I'm Brazilian, so if you don't understand me, just ask and I'll try to repeat. I've been in Scotland for 8 years, and a lot of people ask me, you're a tourism academic, do you travel a lot? And I always have an answer for my students when they ask that. It's like, I traveled less than I want and more than I should, right? So, and the reality of that is, if you really think about the questions that you can ask people around you and your families and your friends, if you ask them, who's been to Paris? You always find people, everyone, oh, most of you here, yeah. Rome? Yeah. London? Yeah. So there are these places where you can ask almost everyone, and there's a high percentage of people who've been to these places, at least here in Scotland or in, like, say, developed countries. But then, have you ever felt that when you're on a holiday, you feel like it's a Black Friday entrance to a store where there's so many people that actually you cannot even move? So I was asking questions on my table there just earlier. How many people do you think per season visit Venice? How many tourists per season in Venice? Any numbers? 5 million. Well, 5 million is the whole number, but per season. So we have 30 tourists per season, so actually it's 20 million visit Venice every year. So now imagine you in your house, there's 4 of you living in a house, but there's 120 people inside the house. It's kind of the allegory that we can make here, right? So in a house of 4 people, 120, right? So that's obviously a concern for the world. So this is Maya Beach. It's been closed now, and that's the amount of tourists. And obviously, do you know why there's so many people visiting that island? Or that Libya? Because of Leonardo DiCaprio, right? Because that's Leonardo DiCaprio went there, decided to make a movie about that place, and then suddenly millions of people coming to visit that. As I said, Venice, if you go to Venice during the summer, but also during other times of the year, you're going to see things like that. And that's obviously not often a scene when you come from Brazil. If you go to Rio, Copacabana, that's probably something that you will see. Now, at the same time, you start to have reactions to that tourism influx, right? So you have more and more things like that where actually tourists are not welcome. So you start to see a huge conflict there in terms of people going to visit a city or a town and then feeling that actually they're not welcome. There is a huge movement in Barcelona to try to stop tourists going there, right? And why is that? Because there's a huge conflict, not only creating issues in terms of cultural conflict, but also as an economic conflict as well, as I'll talk later on. So, the concept of over-tourism that we've been listening more and more, it is talking about ignoring the carrying capacity of this place. So, how many people we have in Inverness? There's about 64,000 people living in Inverness nowadays. There's 70 million people living in UK. How many tourists UK get a year? Near 40 million tourists. So more than 1 for each 0.5 citizens living in UK you get here. So it's a huge influence. So if you see places like Skye, they try to close Skye last summer because of the influx of people, really damaging the local communities, but also the environment there. Ignore the opinion of local communities. we just enter those spaces without asking, can we come here, right? So actually tourists are entering spaces without asking for the permission of going to those places. And we see that in, for example, indigenous communities in Brazil, people just entering the Amazon forest, which now is burning and it's a different thing, but entering indigenous communities without actually asking to visit. Ignoring impacts on climate change, that's more and more evidence that there is huge impacts of the tourism industry, not only the flying sector, because there's a lot about flights and carbon footprint of flights, but actually the whole industry, the whole tourism sector has a huge impact on climate change. And actually, yeah, it generates income, generates jobs, and generates other positive benefits, but we always seem to ignore more and more the negative impacts of tourism. So if you think about the official statistics, there was an estimated 25 million tourists in 1950 around the world, right? That's the number of our arrivals. We are now on 1.4 billion tourists around the world, right? And things are growing. So if any of you have ever used Flight Radar, which is an interesting app, you're gonna see the number of flights all over our head constantly and more, right? So that's obviously an interesting number to see is what is the end point of that tourism? So here you can see, and funny enough, they made that in green when actually maybe should have been another color, maybe should have been redder. So you have the number of arrivals in 1995 and the number of arrivals in 2016 as a comparison here, and actually you can see clearly that it's getting more and more around the world, right? And that's obviously a concern as well in terms of the carrying capacity of our environment. And here you can see obviously how it's growing, and you can see clearly that in 2018, compared to the growth is being speeding quite quickly as well, and obviously this is low-cost airlines, and there are other reasons for that as well, right? So, however, if you think about the increased number of tourists, there's also a reaction to that. Anyone here from Edinburgh? You're from Edinburgh, so you can imagine Edinburgh during the Fringe Festival or during the festivals during the summer, and how problematic it is. And actually, if you see, the military tattoo sales hit by a negative debate about over-tourism. So actually, for the first time, we started to see issues of over-tourism. Serious people don't want to go there because there's already too many people, right? So you see the cruise industry responsible for over-tourism, right? And actually, one of the issues of the cruise industry here is that not only they bring all these tourists there, most of the money these tourists bring don't stay in the local community, right? They'll go and they're going to spend, and this money will leak to multinational corporations around the world. Ruining popular destinations. We're talking about calls for creativity and community engagement as a sort to solve that, or limits on cruise ships as well. Okay? And that goes beyond just the climate change. There's a lot about climate change and pollution and things like that, but goes beyond that. It goes in terms of economic impact on the local communities, cultural conflicts, and so on. But things are slowly changing. Anyone has been to the Uluru Rock here in Australia? So this is a very famous postcard in Australia, right? So you can see that. However, the Aboriginal community said that's enough. That's our spiritual home. We don't want people to come here. We don't want people to climb that. And then from the 26th of October, they're stopping that, right? So they're actually stopping all the climbing into the rock. Okay? And that's because they felt that there was no respect to the meaning of that rock to the Aboriginal community there. But what's happening just now, this week, these days there, just ahead of that deadline? A crazy influx of people there because they know that in a month's time they'll be closed. So actually just now it's much worse than it was ever been because there was the last chance. So that last chance tourism, right? If I don't go now, I won't see it. And more we see that happening around the world. If I don't go now to Bali or Indonesia, because of the changes on the sea level, we may not be able to go that later. So there's less chance tourism opportunities, right? And it's the same about the Maya Beach. So here you can see each of these dots were 170 people visiting daily in 2008. Now here you have 3,500 people visiting a day. So each of these dots is 10 people. Okay, so you can see like in 10 years how tourism changed that area. So traveling around the world is becoming cheaper, right? So if you go to, I remember there was a time where Ryanair was selling flights for £1, right? When they trying to establish, now you can buy flights for 15, 20, 25, 30 pounds, you can buy flights, right? So it is becoming much more accessible. You know, you have more options for staying. So before we were limited to hotels. Now with Airbnb, the accommodation sector has completely changed, right? So it is becoming more accessible. The number of tourists keep going, but now our natural resources are going as well. And there's the whole environmental debate just now. So we keep causing serious environmental, cultural, and social issues. So we need to ask, is there a future for tourism? I was involved in a research project last month in an indigenous community in Argentina. So I went to the Andes in Argentina as part of a project when the indigenous community lives out of mining. Lithium mining. So if you think about lithium of battery cars, they're coming from a lot of these salt deserts around South America. So the community lives out of that. But they are extremely concerned of the impact of that in their communities, plus the dependence of one type of economy, really. So one of the projects they want to do is how they can develop tourism in this indigenous community, right? 12 hours from the biggest city, right? So quite an isolated place. And one of the things is, well, if you want to have tourism here to balance your economy, we really need to think about how we're going to do. Because we're talking about an indigenous community of 45 people living out of mining, expecting now hundreds of tourists coming in, right? So they're building houses in this small indigenous community to accommodate that, but how we can balance that and what will be the impact? Well, people ask me, and students always talk to me about how can we then be more responsible if there's all these problems in tourism, how can actually we be better? How can we be better? Because the reality is, yeah, we may travel less, but we're gonna still be traveling because mobility is part of who we are, but how we can be better? And what I say is usually in the decision process, you need to take our time to decide where we go, right? We cannot just go and be just, oh, it's cheap here, let's go there. Let's think a little bit more about, right? So we need to go beyond that seduction of a deal on a low-cost airline, right? So let's really reflect about where we're going, why we're going, and avoid this push and drive. I'm not sure if you ever know, but you know, with all these cookies and all these things on the internet, as soon as you open to check a holiday or something like this, suddenly it's on your Facebook and suddenly it's on your Twitter, and all these drives trying to ask you, well, why don't you book? You know, hotels are running fast, flights are running fast, the last 5 seats on your flight, everything is driving you to make this very fast decision. Think about the modes of transport and accommodation you're using. Yeah, we just saw Greta Thunberg traveling across the ocean to go to US on a carbon-free crossing, but can we actually think about, you know, our modes of transport and where we are going and the type of accommodation we are using as well? And think and research about the destination you are traveling. Try to understand the cultural aspects. If the people want you there, right? If you are welcomed there as a tourist, right? Think about the environmental fragility of the place. Think about the responsible behavior of the suppliers. So not only where you're staying, but you know, what are the suppliers involved on that? When you get to the destination, remember that you are a guest. So at the end, when we go to these places, we are still guests in someone's house. So remember the example of Venice. We are talking about 30 people per resident. So we're talking about 30 people inside the house per person. So if you come in a house where 4 people live, we're talking about 120 people inside your house. Be grateful for the local community to allow you to go there. Engage with the local population and respect the traditions and ways of living. Right? So we see people going to New Zealand trying to engage with the Maori in very disrespectful ways. We see people going to Australia trying to engage with the Aboriginal people in very disrespectful ways. We see that in Scotland with the clans as well, and with the island communities and things like that. So we need to think about how we can respect traditions and ways of living. We need to think about how and where we are spending our monies and if they are benefiting local people. sometimes we just spend money and we don't think about, is this actually benefiting the local people? Or is that being absorbed by some multinational corporation? Right? So how are we actually using our money, spending our money? We need to interact with the local people and learn from them. Make that an important journey of being a tourist. And never to forget to be as responsible in those places as you would be in your own home. Right? It is funny when you get, and you travel. The other day I was traveling to Hungary, and half of the flight was from people on stag parties, on hen parties. And it's fascinating to see the behavior of people on those types of trips. Right? And we all say, well, we were all young at some point, we all did things that were not really, but we need to think about the volume of stag and hen parties and how they are behaving. It is something that we need to reflect about. So people then say, okay, so again, we can think about all of these, but how we actually implement strategies and how we actually can fight over tourism. So one of them is how we can create education of tourists. How we can actually educate tourists before they go and while they are there to act and think about the act. What we're going to see is definitely a more regulated sector. Right? Believe me, one way or the other, we're going to see the governments being a little bit more strict in terms of who can come, when they come, and how things will be organized in terms of the private sector. Public policy should protect local communities, local culture, traditions, and vulnerable environments. So we're going to see more and more things like what we saw in Maya Beach, or things like we're seeing in Uluru, or things we're going to see very soon in Venice in terms of how we're going to restrict those and try to protect local communities and local environments. Okay? There's no way to escape that. And then we need to see power and cohesiveness of communities. So we need to empower communities, indigenous communities, aboriginal communities, island communities, small rural communities, to actually feel that they have control of who is coming, how they're coming, where they're going to spend the money, how they're going to benefit us, right? And in what terms these things will happen. We may see increase in costs and taxes. So there's a lot of talks in Edinburgh now about tourist tax, and how that would benefit or not, and how that would be regulated. The reality is, on that level, the tax will benefit and may help in a lot of things. The reality is, won't cut the number of tourists. So you're still going to have the issue that every June or July, when you go out on the street, you won't be barely able to walk, and you won't be able to park your car, and the price of food will be much higher, and all these other things. We may see a potential danger of making tourism something for fuel. And then we need to think about what do we do, because it's supply and demand as well, right? So if you cut the number of tourists, it becomes more expensive. Are we making tourists elitist again? So how we change that? So on that, we may see, for example, aspects such as quotas being open, right? Or bureaucratic applications being placed so people can actually be drawers or something like that in terms of number of tourists we're going to see. We may see a cap of length of stay. So there is more and more talks saying about, for example, if you go to Venice, they're going to register you and you can go to San Marco Basilica once in 5 years or once in 10 years. So you may start to see that they can cap those numbers of stays and numbers of visits in the future. Right? So you'll not be allowed to stay more than 2 hours here, 2 hours there, or you can only come once every 5 years or so on. We may see a regional restriction of air travel. We may see, well, people can travel once or twice a year, or 3 times a year, right? So we may start to see things changing dramatically with new technology that will restrict these things for us in the future, right? Which is quite interesting and can be quite scary for us when we're in a period of hypermobility. Now, what does that mean for the young generation? I think there is a lot of actually overlaps with what Anna was saying before with the Star Trek, which is, well, we're going to see VR being used more and more in terms of giving the people an idea. We may see space tourism being developed more and more. You see that growing quite fast in terms of the development and technological developments. And we may see things like that, where actually you're going to see the places from a distance. You cannot go and you cannot touch anymore, as we are already seeing this in Uluru. So in Uluru, from the plan for after October is to stop people to getting too close or being able to access the mountain in itself. So we may see people just being stopped at a different distance. So when we think about tourism, we usually think about where do we go next summer? Where we go on holidays? Right? And then we go online and you do some search and say, well, we go here, we go there. You know, if you think about Ibiza, Mallorca, Tenerife, favorite spots of British people, favorite spots of my students, right? Now, every time I have a student who go to Tenerife, I usually ask them, where do you go in Tenerife? They go to those main resorts, those main hotels, those main pubs. They go to Irish pub in Tenerife, right? And the interesting thing is, you ask them, oh, have you done a trek on the Teide? Or have you went to see the historic cities? Or have you seen other places? And they don't know. So they usually, and what's the problem with that is a lot of the leakage of the money doesn't benefit the local community, just go to these multinational hotels. So, where you should go, why are we going there? What's the reason actually for having that, to go to these places? And again, a lot of the students that I ask about is usually because of the weather, right? Even if the weather is not too bad. But a lot of them is because of the sunshine, right? And I do appreciate that. A lot of them is because, you know, it is cool, or because it's cheaper, or so on. But we need to ask, why are we going to these places? Actually, are we welcome there? There's more and more signs that tourists are not welcome in Barcelona or Venice. So why are we going to a place where we are actually not welcome anymore? What are we allowed to do? When we go to these places, actually, have you ever thought about what can we do on those places? And what are the types of behavior we are expected to follow? Or we just expect they to accept our behavior as we do at home? And is that a sustainable way to get there? Is that a sustainable way to stay there? Right? Is that a sustainable way to consume products and food and things in those countries? Do we need to start to think about that more if we want a better tourism? Obviously, all these, we need to say that tourism will still be our part because we are mobile people, right? And we are going to keep being mobile. But we need to start to re-ask those questions. And actually, tourist has been the main word for tourism. And in the future, local communities will be the main word for tourism. So the tourism will go from the tourist to the local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro. A lot of what